Okay, welcome back. It's Thursday, your financial path to peace. And I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit today in the sense that I was going to do this topic 100% no matter what because it's so close to me. But somebody put it in a comment so perfectly, I'm going to use their comment to talk about it, despite the fact that this is not my Saturday societal comment section. They just put it so perfectly, and it's totally a topic that's near and dear to my heart, so it's something I've wanted to talk about under the idea of your finances anyways. This is just kind of a philosophy to me. And you know how I told you guys on another video I can't figure out how to be able to read a comment and video myself at the same time. Well, it dawned on me that I can read the comment and do the voiceover. So I'll put the comment on the screen and then I'll read it that way. Hi Sage. Being frugal can be amazingly satisfying, I think. Kind of like how our ancestors must have felt when they made do with so little. To hear the old stories, they fully enjoyed and appreciated what they did have. My paternal grandparents, who were farmers in the Appalachian Mountains, survived the Great Depression of the 1930s. My father told me that they didn't really notice how poor, in quotations, which is what really impacted me on this statement. My father told me that they didn't really notice how poor they were or that things had changed that much. They even had enough to share with their neighbors too. Great stewards of the land and resources. Love, Carol. Amen, Carol. Now I don't have it in front of me while I'm recording, so that's the only challenge. I'd like to refer back and forth to the comment, but it's another reason why I can't really do reaction videos, because without an extra camera to film me and then react to the video going back and forth, it's just going to be too difficult. Anyways, there's a lot I want to say about this subject. So I'm going to try to just do it concisely in this video, and maybe later on it will probably be a subject that comes back over and over. I do not like the word poor. I don't actually agree with it. I don't really think it's a definitive word in the sense that there's a definition for it. I think it's a word that we use to describe things in a way that we can conceptualize so that we can have a conversation back and forth, but I don't think it's actually a definitive or descriptive word other than coming from our own experience. You know, like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, poor is also in the eye of the beholder in some sense. Let me explain myself. If you think of your ancestors, and that's why this comment was just beautiful, because again, like whether she commented this or not, this is totally a subject that you would have heard from me, because this is just something that's been on my mind for years and years and years and years, especially having traveled around the world. I don't know how many countries I went to, but over 35. I've seen a lot, and I've stayed in slums. I've stayed in some of the worst slums in the world, and I've stayed with tribes. I've stayed, in places where there's absolutely nothing around them, and their houses or their shelter is built out of cow manure. But she put it perfectly, speaking of the Appalachian Mountains and her ancestors. If you think of your ancestors, or you think of the people who lived in the 1800s, many of them have this, if they're lucky, some, Native Americans lived in tents, okay, teepees, right? They were better than the material that we use today for tents, but they lived in teepees. A lot of the European ancestors, they built in a variety of ways, but specifically, maybe especially if they were in colder environments, they're building these little log cabins. These families, they have like 5 to 8 children, and they're all in this one little room. Maybe, if you're lucky, there's a divider where the parents sleep, and then all the 5 to 8 kids sleep in another room. And then you have that fireplace that's supposed to heat the whole area, but really they're relying on their blankets and they're relying on their body heat in order to keep them warm. We don't look at them and say they're poor. Like, that's not, we can, again, because we're trying to have a conversation, so we're taking a word and just using it in a way to have the conversation flow and to describe something that we conceptually think. But one person's poor is not another person's poor either. So it's not really a definition. And when we talk about our ancestors, we don't often use the word poor, because in that day and age, that could have even been wealthy. You know what I mean? Like, in that day and age, everybody either lived at that level or less. As time went by, progression, our houses got bigger and there was more conveniences. But in that day and age, you were grateful to have just that shelter from a storm outside. It didn't mean you were poor. And I know I'm going to kind of botch this because it does mean so much to me. When I'm done recording, I'm going to be like, I didn't say it right, and I should have added this or that or whatever. And that's why this concept is going to come up multiple times, I'm sure, throughout my life of YouTube. But I don't like that word. I'd prefer not to use it at all, because I do think it's taken wrongly, sometimes manipulated, actually. And so let me go along with that idea of the manipulation that can happen with that word. You say somebody's poor, and then defining yourself is not at that level, right? So the minute you call somebody poor, or you say that they're poor, suddenly you're putting them in a certain level, and you're putting yourself at a different level by using that descriptive for that individual. Again, it helps the conversation flow, so I'm not trying to be like the biggest stickler in the world, but the concept is important. It's very important to me. I hope that you can kind of grapple with it and see what I'm trying to say. I wish it was actually more important to more people. But that word poor can be manipulated in the sense that even when you, as an innocent person, are just using it as a descriptive, and you say that homeless person's poor, or that family's poor, you put yourself at a certain level and you put them at a certain level. Okay? That's an innocent thing. I'm not saying that that's nefarious or manipulative. However, it then can be taken in that way. Okay, everybody kind of agrees that this is the level, and everybody kind of would call this poor. So it's taken either in a political sense, or sometimes, I hate to say this, but sometimes non-governmental charity organizations use it. I'll tell you this, I was in Africa, and I'm talking to this guy who's African, he's black African. He's like, I really hate the way that the West, perhaps even your country specifically, puts these commercials out. It just makes us like, they take the worst of the worst, and then everybody has this idea that that's what Africa's like. A bunch of children with like bloated bellies and skinny legs and, flies all over their face. And he's like, and I'm not saying that doesn't necessarily happen in some places or in some ways, but it's that depiction. And then they ask for all this money, and they're not even perhaps with those particular people that have that particular trial. And I'll tell you what, I've been all over Africa, again, in the slums, in so many places, and only a very small and a very few times did I see that visual depiction. Only very few times did I see that with my own eyes. So many of these children that live in these slums, and I'm not saying that that's the greatest thing. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't give and we shouldn't. But you've got to be, this goes back to my needs versus wants. Some of these children who are growing up in these slums, for a soccer ball, they're taking garbage from wherever they can find it, which happens to be strewn throughout, and they're wrapping it up with whatever they can wrap it up with to make a ball, and they're playing soccer. We look at that and we're like, oh my gosh, that's so sad. Those poor kids. And we're saying that out of the kindness of our hearts. Again, I'm not trying to make us all sound bad. That's not my point at all. I'm just trying to say, listen to the language and listen to the concept that turns on in your mind having these things, and in the mind of that child who's now hearing the word and starting to feel that way about themselves. That's the whole thing. I saw this with my own eyes in these countries, and I have felt it myself. When I traveled around the world for 2+ years, I only had 2 pairs of clothes to wear during the week and then one for Sunday. That's it, okay? For the most part. Sometimes I was in the colder environments, I've already explained that, and I got the extra stuff. But for the most part, that's the way I lived. I had a backpack on me. That backpack was dirty and tattered and everything after so many different experiences. By the time I got to Europe, which was more towards the end of my travels, by the time I got to the Western world, people would look at me and look down on me. Right? I got kicked out of a few hotels. Like, I stopped at the hotel and I went inside the lobby just to take a break, to kind of look at my map and see where I was trying to go and yada, yada, yada. And I had people come and kick me out, okay? At the time, it didn't bug me at all. I was just a backpacker. I was just a traveler. I mean, I thought it was a little rude or whatever, but it didn't psychologically do any number to me, okay? Fast forward so many years, my first little experience, which I'm not going to go into much detail here because I don't want this video to be astronomically long. That's why this subject's going to come back again and again. But fast forward a few years, when I got my first little taste of homelessness, I stayed at a shelter, okay? And I was coming out of the shelter, and all of us, you get kicked out at 6 o'clock in the morning, okay? So everybody, and you have to bring everything that you have. You can't leave anything behind. So everybody in this area knew that people were hoarding out of this shelter. So they knew who the homeless people were, especially if they're driving in their car at 6 o'clock in the morning and they see all these people walking along the highway at that time. So you could tell. And I went up to this restaurant and I had a can of tuna and a loaf of bread that I carried with me. The same meal that I carried with me while I was traveling. The same backpack. Really essentially the same clothes. The same 2 pairs and one for Sunday. Like, everything was the same. I looked the same. I was the same person. Everything was the same. And when I went up to that restaurant and I knocked on their back, like, the guy had come out and he went back in, and he went back in before I could, get his attention. So I just knocked on the door and I said, I just need this opened. Would you mind? Because in his mind, he knew where I came from. And as a matter of fact, at the moment, that was true. I did come from that shelter. But because in his mind, he knew that, he looked at me and he looked me up and down. And I'll never forget this. It was such a defining moment and a play on your mind. Oh my gosh. And he looked at me up and down. He did open the can for me. I went over and I sat on this bench with my backpack next to me. And I looked at myself up and down. And I was a little dirty, but no different than traveling around the world. But here I am in the United States. This guy looks at me. Nothing's changed. And I just felt this shift inside my soul. I felt this shift inside my head. And because, okay, there's a bit of religion here for you, but because of religion and because I know who I am inside me, it didn't take complete hold. Okay? Didn't matter to me what somebody else was thinking of me at that moment. I know my value before God and I know who I am. At that time, it didn't take complete hold. Fast forward through trauma and everything else and how I'm starting to feel about myself, and I'm, losing that strength with God and yada, yada, yada. But even at that time, that was the only belief that kept me even a slightly grounded. But I literally felt it. I literally felt it in my heart, and I felt it in my mind, and I felt a shift. Again, a shift I was able to combat only because of that one thing, but a shift nonetheless. I felt this psychological shift, and things were different. Things were different because of that. even despite that I knew who I was. And again, not entirely different for me, but a concept distilled upon me. It was a seed that was planted that was even going to affect me regardless, right? I didn't know, but I also didn't know I was going to be in this situation for many, 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 many years to come. But that seed was planted despite that strength that I had. And there's so many people that don't have that. So that wouldn't even been a seed for them. That would have been a cementing pinnacle. That would have been a foundational idea in their mind. And eventually it took root in me as well. I see it. I feel it. It makes me look at myself differently. It makes me look at myself differently. So not only are the normal people, and again, good-hearted people, but using this word, not only are people differentiating, and again, I know it's descriptive, but when we differentiate that way, when we continue to use the word, and it changes the mind of the individual you're using to describe, and it takes away their power to get out of the situation. It really does. And there are some people, okay? There are some people who totally use that word as a descriptive. I am better than you and you are lower than me simply because of our resources and the way we live and what we have financially. And that plays on people's minds. That plays on the have-nots' minds. To the point they think that they can never be the haves. Man, I don't like the word poor. And yet, in the future, you'll hear me use it. You know, I'll try to do air quotes because as a signifier that I don't like the word. But it is a descriptive in order to have a conversation. And how can you define somebody with that word? That's kind of what I started with. How can you define somebody with that word? Our ancestors were not poor. In that time period, they were actually quite wealthy if they had a cabin. Now, if they had the same cabin and they were cramming 8 kids in there and they had no central heating and no washer and no dryer and no cell phone and no internet and no yada, 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 they're poor. It's gone so far that now it's a human right to have all of these needs that are clearly wants. You can get free cell phones now. The immigrants who are coming to this country right now, last I heard, they're getting $2,500 a month. They're getting free phones. They're getting shelter in like 5-star hotels. They're getting EBT on top of it, so the free food on top, like, and this is not a video to talk about the immigrants. My point is where's our line? If that's our line for the homeless, and that's the thing, the government asks for billions of dollars, millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. California has gotten millions upon millions of dollars to solve the homeless crisis. And if you broke it down, I can't remember the numbers now, but if you broke it down to the individuals, the amount that they're paying per individual is like a lot of money. You sitting at home are not making that much money a month. And they're spending it on these hotels and they're spending it on this. They're basically just creating all these little avenues and all these ways so that this money can just go into a bunch of people's pockets. It's really not entirely serving the homeless, period. And number 2, it's not the problem. It's not the biggest problem. It's really just not. I actually do think that they're nefarious in what they're doing. They're trying to filter that money. Some of these charity organizations in California, and I have firsthand experience with this, are pocketing that money. But again, That's not my point. My point is where's the line? What's the need and what's the want? Really? The need? The need. If you live in the East Coast, you need that $2,500 a month, plus all of your food meant, plus free shelter, plus this. Holy cow. When I went back east to look for that guy, I did talk to some people. Oh, how much is your rent? How much is this? How much is that? I know how much it costs to buy the food, to eat the food there. I did that for myself for months. $2,500 a month, plus all your food and your shelter taken care of. And a free phone, and free internet, and... My point is the money. Needs versus wants. The word, the psychology, the answers. The video's too long. I'm sorry. We'll talk about this subject again. Anyways, thank you, Carol. You worded it beautifully. I appreciate you. I appreciate all your comments. You really are a diehard. Talk to you later.